The more evidence, the better, I say.
I mean, this is so improbable.
That's a bold statement.
I mean, I think that's a fair point, but I didn't make that argument. He did.
Why is that true? Is that a good question? Maybe it's not.
Drew, you're not supposed to ask good questions like that. Don't ask difficult questions.
Bill, jump in here.
I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic.
You're listening to The Divide. Drew is not with us. He'll be part of the after show to critique my conversation here with Ryan.
Cool.
Ryan, good to see you. Ryan is. I have tried to get an interview with Ryan, and here he is finally. The national organizing director of SSA.
Yeah.
And the guy I have mainly been in contact with, and has I should say very clearly to Christian listeners that Ryan has been absolutely a professional, has treated me with the highest of respect, and is much appreciated.
Yeah. No. Last year when you reached out to be at the conference and said, hey, would it be okay if a Christian you're a theologian, aren't you, or historian?
I'm a classicist.
Classicist,
so I
yeah.
have no formal biblical
You're a classicist.
expertise.
I get it. Yeah, you're a classicist. Yeah, I know your type.
Yeah.
So I was like, yeah, that'd be great. Especially when you told me your ethic of like how you go about publishing your conversations with approval from the other person. It's not a gotcha kind of thing. And I was like, oh, that's my kind of thing. I'm all in favor of that type of
Yeah, I thought it really took a high degree of trust, honestly. And also, I would think you wouldn't really want to open the door to having a bunch of Christians around here trying to interview. Do you really want, I'm trying to think of the famous people that go on the street, Kirk. The actor.
Kirk Cameron.
Do you really want everybody swarming around here interviewing people?
Yeah.
I'm guessing not, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think for this particular context, we're looking at helping students grow in their leadership abilities.
Yeah.
But they do most of our students will host debates on their campuses. They'll welcome inter-religious dialogue and even disagreement. So they like to flex that muscle from time to time and have a little back and forth.
It'd be like an atheist booth at an apoloetics convention or something. Give them a chance to...
That meme that's become famous, you sit at a table, changed my mind.
Yeah, that's great. So you were a pastor?
I was. For
a Christian
20
pastor?
20 years. Yeah.
20 years?
Yeah.
You look very young.
Oh, thank you. Not as young as I used to be.
Yeah. The right response is, you look young as well.
You look young as well.
It's fine. So you look... So forget that. Anyway, you're... 20 years is a long time to be a Christian pastor, and then now you're an atheist.
Yeah, just like that. One day I woke up and none of it made any sense to me anymore.
Yeah.
No.
So explain that.
Yeah. So I grew up in a family of Methodists, but not I wouldn't say they were committed to Methodism per se. When we were in Ohio at the time, when we moved out to California, my mom's folks, who we temporarily lived with in the transition, were Seventh-day Adventists, and so we went to church with them, and that was a little weird because church is on Saturday, and there were some suspicions about whether Seventh-day Adventists were really Christians or not. So we started going to church with them, and my mom and dad eventually became Seventh-day Adventists after studying the Bible more with my grandparents, and so I sort of grew up more or less in the Seventh-day Adventist church, and I was a pretty religious kid. I feel like I had a religious sensibility about me all of my growing up years. I think if I hadn't been raised in a religious family, I would probably be saying that I had a sort of a philosophical bent. I wanted to. I was just inquisitive about the world and people and origins and all that stuff. So. Because my family was religious, we pretty naturally gravitated towards, I gravitated more and more towards religion. And when I had the opportunity, I went to a Christian college right out of my elementary and middle school, and that was great. I was so excited to get academic credit for studying theology. I thought that was, kind of almost like I had, rigged the system or something.
Yeah.
And made one transfer that's not really relevant, but anyway, graduated with a theology degree and started right into pastoral ministry right out of my undergrad. I was 23 years young and had 3 churches in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and then went back and got my master's degree in the late 90s and my MDiv, and then went back to the Philadelphia area but in a different congregation. And
no major doubts really in those years?
No, it's funny, not the big ones, not the big doubts about the credibility of my denomination's claims from time to time,
sure.
Especially during seminary. The Adventists, for your listeners who may not be aware, one of the big issues in the Seventh-day Adventist Church is the Seventh-day Sabbath, which is part of the name of the denomination. And so, Adventists have their way of explaining why Sabbath, and it's essentially, the creation story. The seventh day was sanctified, and there's really no change of that. Like, you don't find a text that says, "Oh, now it's Sunday." But Christians will say that there's like an old covenant, new covenant kind of thing. And I was momentarily convinced by that, which threw me into a kind of crisis about my Adventism, not my Christianity so much. And then other claims, like Adventists claim to be the remnant. A lot of denominations claim to be the remnant.
They're the elect.
The special people. And Adventists have their special reasons why they're the special people. And all special people claims, I'm like highly suspicious about that. It just seems too good to be true. I guess that's what it strikes me. Like, oh, so I am of this last generation of culminates with me.
Yeah.
Like how
feels pretty good.
Feels pretty good, yeah. So I was like, I don't know about all that, but I was on a career path, and it wasn't so crass as I make it sound. I had invested a lot of time in my education, and I thought, well, in spite of my sort of uncertainty about some of these claims, I can still do a lot of good as a pastor. And overall, I feel like a lot of denominationalism is essentially history. It's not so much, especially in the Gen X generation, it became less and less about denominational identity and more about, I'm an Adventist essentially because I was born an Adventist, And it was my community, it was my home, it was my people. If I had been born in a Mennonite family, I'd probably be Mennonite, or Baptist or whatever. So I didn't quibble too much over that as long as the denomination gave me freedom to sort of express my ministry.
What you really thought.
Yeah. And so, but as you can imagine, along the way, I'm also encountering more and more problems. So what I discovered rather quickly is that people are not sort of perfect articulations of theology. So they're messy, right?
Yeah.
And they don't obey all the rules all the time. And so then you're confronted as a pastor pretty early on with, well, there's people and there's rules, and how do they fit, right? So
easy to be cynical that they really believe this stuff.
Right, or legalistic, like, is it absolutely like, hey, the Bible says if you're divorced, that's against God's will, and so some people say within in my denomination and other denominations, you have to be excommunicated or disfellowshipped. So I know people who my mom and dad, being my mom especially, because she got remarried. The key is not getting remarried.
Yeah.
So my mom was disfellowshipped from her church when I was about 11 because she got remarried. And I was like, as a young person, as a preteen, I'm like, that seems pretty messed up. But I didn't know theology and all of that. So I think that there's a lot of things like that I started to bend the rules a little bit, I started to say like, well, we're better to be, when you're going through a trial than with your community, And so that was the beginning of my liberalization, you might say, where I started to make exceptions to these.
The text didn't match reality, so you need to sort of bend the text a little bit to fit the complexities of the real world.
Yeah, which is essentially a good definition of theology, I think. Like, theology is like, how do we take this ancient text and this modern world, and how do they make sense to each other? And so we have, theologies to explain all sorts of things, right?
Sure.
Because the Bible doesn't say anything about watching TV, so you have to say, well, what would the Bible say? You know what I mean? That whole process.
Yeah, WWJD, that's all you got to do.
That's all you got to do, simple. So that started to erode a little bit, and I started thinking, well, I'm happy to be an Adventist, but Adventists aren't special, which is really enough almost in some places to be terminated right there, because you have to believe it's special, otherwise what are you doing? It'd be like, one guy said to me, it'd be like selling Hondas, but you're like, but Fords are really better.
Yeah.
And I drive a Ford, or whatever. So, that wouldn't make any sense. You'd be fired and go get a job over at Ford.
Yeah.
So
reminds me of the commercial of was it the guy with Pepsi that was dropping all the Pepsi off and he reaches to grab the Coke, or it might be reversed, and then it all he's trying to do it secretively and then it all just collapses all over.
Yeah, he's like, I guess I'm found out. So then I got a call to be the pastor of the Adventist Church in Hollywood, California, and I was kind of at the end of my own personal rope when I took that call. I had written an article called Becoming Useless, and I just thought, I'm not really what this denomination wants. Like, they wouldn't hire me today. Like, they're putting up with me.
Yeah.
And that's not a great feeling.
How old were you then?
34, maybe.
Were you married?
Yeah, 2 kids. Okay. Yeah, so I had some skin in the game.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, Hollywood, that sounds like a pretty open-minded place. Like, maybe I can carve out a space there. And I even at that point had the thought cross my mind, if I can't make it in Hollywood, that's probably the last stop for me. I didn't mean last stop in Christianity necessarily at that time, but I thought, I don't know if I could be an Adventist anymore, or if I could be a pastor even anymore, or if I would want to be. So, we come to California and in 2005 and pretty quickly discovered that this place was amazing. Like, the congregation was small and had declined a lot, but had a lot of potential. It started to grow, but it grew with all the wrong people. Like, it grew with homeless people, marginal people, immigrants of different types, gay and lesbian people, all the people that...
Wrong meaning hard to form what is what people think is the ideal church.
Right.
Stable.
Right. The church, they're like, why is your tithe and offering not going up, And I was like, have a look,
Yeah.
This is not to be arrogant, but this is Jesus' kind of ministry.
Yeah.
So we're not catering to the Pharisees, So we were really proud of that, hopefully in a good way, but eventually Prop 8 came along in California and the whole gay marriage thing hit the fan, and we took a very controversial position as a congregation to push back against Prop 8 when the denomination in California really took a strong stand in favor of Prop 8, and that was a big schism, and a couple of trips to the regional office to chat with the president, and that was pretty tense, and I thought, this could be the end of the road. They might be like, okay, bye. But for whatever reason, I survived that, and then...
Were you thinking at the time, that your ideas were that you were taking the teachings of the New Testament, say, and you were thinking, we're the ones who really reflect what the New Testament is saying, or what it says literally, we can see that, but it's just wrong-headed for our generation, or what? Did you have a...
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because I think there's a divide there for me. Yeah. So on the one hand, it was like the work of, sort of this liberation theology. For me, I could connect that to the text, the ministry of Jesus, and even, the Adventist Church is very big on the book of Revelation. And, there's a really incredible political reading of the book of Revelation, which is essentially John in a protest against the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
And so you're a classicist. So, so this anti-imperial kind of thing, and N.T. Wright does a bunch of stuff with, no Caesar but Jesus kind of God kind of thing. And I just love that. That was like candy for me. I just thought that was so radical and so subversive, and a way to really make sense out of what I was trying to do in an urban congregation. Yeah. But it wasn't lucrative. It didn't pay for itself. So I was always vulnerable to the whims of the denomination because I wasn't pulling my weight, financially. The divide came for me with the question of LGBT folks. And I came to the point after reading lots of books and articles that that people who read the New Testament and come to the conclusion that Paul is not in favor of same-sex relationships are probably right. Okay. That Paul is probably not in favor of same-sex relationships. And that to interpret it in such a way that he is in favor of that or would be tolerant of that is a stretch at best. Mm-hmm. So I came to the point where I said, I think that Paul's wrong about this.
Yeah.
And I think if Paul were reincarnated, though we don't believe in reincarnation, but if Paul were here today somehow, he'd be like, oof, yeah, I would change a few things about that. But that doesn't comport with Revelation, even the version, because the Adventist Church was never verbal, literal inspiration, like a plenary inspiration.
Okay.
The Adventist Church was never on that mode. So they were always like Ellen White, the prophetess of the Adventist Church, said, God's not on trial in the words of the Bible. Like God speaks through his penman, she would say.
Okay.
And the penman wrote down what they understood God to be telling them. So there was a gap there into which you could insert some human fallibility. Mm-hmm. So, you could have in the Chronicles a certain tally of the census that David took, and in, Kings you could have a different one, and it's not a problem because we're really not trusting that Revelation's going to get the number right exactly, or whatever. Mm-hmm. So, or even the ancient writers thought about numbers in the same way we do, right? So, yeah, I mean, they're not looking.
That's pretty common, even in the evangelical scholarship.
That's right. Yeah. And then I think also the some of the theology that really almost split the evangelical church at one point around the openness of God. There's kind of almost latent within Adventism a kind of openness understanding of that, of God's will and the way that God's will unfolds in the world.
Yeah.
So anyway, all of that to say, when I came to the point where I thought, the New Testament's not right on this, that's a big breaking point.
Big change. It's interesting because I think a lot of people tend to want to bend it so far, and often bend it their whole lives, to a point where they wouldn't take your position that Paul, a fair reading of him is that he would not be in favor of these relationships. I think that, to me, that seems sort of clear from a careful reading, and the people attempting to sort of stretch it into Paul was maybe latently gay or any number of things. I would think, it's probably better just to acknowledge what he wrote, say you don't agree with it, as you did, and move on.
Yeah, and he wasn't super down with women in leadership either. You can try to
twist, sure.
Yeah, you can try to twist that around all sorts of ways by pointing to Junia and all the rest. But
the bottom line is pretty clear that he expected.
And guess what? His behavior didn't always line up with his teaching, which is true for a lot of us. Like he probably, he said, women should not blah, blah, blah. And then he had supporters and helpers that were women. And he was like, look, what are you going to do?
Yeah. Certainly in the leadership of the church, he only envisioned men, leading the church.
Right. Exactly. And you can make cultural excuses and say, well, of course, in his time, that would have been to be expected and all the rest. But it's still there in the text, Mm-hmm. And so you either have to have a very open view of inspiration, or you have to just say this is wrong, or some combination.
A living Bible equivalent, right, to the living Constitution.
Yeah, exactly. Like open to, and then there was. I remember reading a guy named Webb. I forget his first name now, but he was talking about a model of interpretation which projected out. So if there's a trajectory, that's what he called it, a moral trajectory theology, where you'd have, ancient Israelites, saying if your child disobeys you, stone them. Yeah. To now, Paul would never say stone your children, but he would still say the gays maybe should be stoned. Mm-hmm. But now in 2000, whatever, you could almost project out that that's where that's headed. And it's a lot to ask of modern people to go through all of that. And I've sort of had an experience a time or two where I've thought there are 3 verses and there are a library full of books trying to understand those 3 verses. Maybe, just maybe, those 3 verses aren't that important. Do we need, if it takes you that many books to justify and explain away these 3 verses or whatever, then maybe you're barking up the wrong tree.
So what was your next move then?
So my next move was to get fired from the denomination. In the Adventist church...
Not resign.
Yeah. Well, they wanted me to resign, and I was like, no, I like my people, I like my congregation, I love my ministry, we're doing all this cool stuff. I had really taken on a kind of social gospel approach to the ministry. Yeah. I wasn't... In the pulpit, I was not making arguments for, the truth claims of a certain... Yeah. In my own thinking, I had sort of given up on heaven and hell. I was like, maybe,
You kind of wanted a kind of Christianity, but not like the historical Orthodox one, I guess.
Right, yeah, I guess so, yeah. And one that would mobilize people into present-day action.
Yeah.
The way that, like, Reformed Judaism does for maybe atheist Jews or secular Jews, to do good, do mitzvah in the world. And the question...
There's plenty of Christian churches that are like that, right?
Yeah, I think there are, yeah. And I think the question of... I can imagine being confronted by an atheist when I was in those days, and they would say, oh, but this is all nonsense. And I would say, oh, maybe.
Yeah. I would think at some point, even if you had stayed in that position longer than you were allowed, I would have thought the sort of intellectual dissonance of, I'm calling this Christian, but really it's starting to not be like these texts. It's
like Christian adjacent or like culturally Christian or something. We even were doing these Holy Saturday, because we were Seventh-day Adventist, our main church day was Saturday, but Easter, complicatedly, falls on Sunday. So we were like, all my career, I was like, how do we properly do justice to Easter? And so we would try to do Saturday and then Sunday, but nobody really wants to come to church 2 days in a row. So then do we just skip Saturday that week? But then the purists were like, oh my God, we're switching to Sunday church services. So I was like, what are we going to do? And just through my own theological development, I discovered, the ancient tradition of Holy Saturday. And I was like, oh, this is a treasure.
Solves the problem.
So this really led me to atheism, basically, because there's a whole kind of like atheist tradition, in a way, within Christianity. Zizek even talks about that Jesus was an atheist on the cross, like for just a second, where he's like, I give up, basically, and my father forsook me, and then he died.
So what happened then after you get out, you're fired?
Yeah, so I left, and I did because I had been there for a little while in the denomination, I got a couple months severance. So I had a little breathing room, but I also knew that D-Day was coming, right, where I had to figure out what to do. And I did take a little break. Because the church was in such turmoil, and they kept drawing me back into that turmoil, and I loved them, and I was fighting with them, and I was finally like, I got to get out of here. So I went to Nicaragua for 6 weeks and studied Spanish some more just to get away.
You took your family?
For a little bit of it. I went alone for part of it.
Okay.
My then wife was very gracious to give me about 4 weeks on my own, and then her mom watched our kids, and she joined me for a week. And we had a little vacation before I came back. And I just say that to say, like, I just unplugged.
Yeah.
And I was reading Spanish language material and, like, Nicaraguan political history. Because that's where I was, and I like history and politics.
Yeah.
So, and that was what I feasted on for 6 weeks, and didn't think a thing about all that mess, So then I came back, and I was like, well, I got to figure out what to do. Both work-wise, but also existentially, like where am I at? So I started church shopping because I was confronted with the possibility of being a hypocrite, that all these years I had been urging people to come to church, and I was like, forget it.
Right.
And I was like, oh no, I got to find a church, like I got to be like committed to this, and I shopped around all the possibilities, not all of them, but a number of them, and including very progressive Episcopalian churches and emergent evangelical flavors, and even Catholic, because a lot of my social justice colleagues in the interfaith world were Catholic, and a lot of Catholic immigrants, Mexican immigrants, and Latin American immigrants in LA, and so gave that a whirl, but that was never going to be for me. And at the end of it, I was like, I think I'm going to just take a year, because by then it was like December. Oh, by the way, my last Sabbath in my church was Holy Saturday. That was it. That was my last day, my last sermon. So that's like April, and then by now it's December, and I'm trying to think, what am I going to do with my life? And I thought, well, I'll write whatever it is, I'm going to take a year, and the words I used then were, I'm going to take a year and explore atheism as an experiment. I'm going to take a year, what did I say? Something like not pretend, that's what people accuse me of. Can't remember exactly how I worded it.
But live on the premise of atheism.
That's right, yeah. Basically, I'm not going to pray, I'm not going to go to church, I'm not going to read my Bible, which I already kind of wasn't doing. And
how were you, if I may say, you were working then or something?
I wasn't. No, I had some adjunct teaching positions.
Okay.
And one at Fuller and one at Azusa Pacific, and and I was also doing teaching a bioethics class at Loma Linda University. And,
Okay.
and then I had a consulting gig with a church that wanted to get more involved in their community.
So were you blogging in this experience?
Not yet. So
Okay.
then in January 1st, I launched this blog, and it blew up. A really well-known atheist blogger saw my first post, because I posted it on the Huffington Post at the time. I had a blog there, and he picked it up and like took issue with the terms I was using to describe my journey.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, that's not what atheism means, or that's not what it's really about. And so I wrote, my next blog post was like, cool, like this is a learning experience for me. So what is it about? Like, that's my whole project, is to figure out from other atheists, what does their atheism mean to them? And
your wife is?
My wife is working as she's has had multiple businesses, but at that time she was pretty much primarily a hairstylist. And I was still with some severance and this kind of gig thing I was doing.
And still herself believing and less struggling?
Yeah, like irritated with the church, really hurt by how the church handled my situation, but still a Christian.
Yeah.
And I think sympathetic to the idea that I might question all of it. And so I launched this blog, and I checked with my consulting, the guy that had hired me as a consultant, and said, I'm going to write this blog. Do you think that'll be a problem for you guys? He's like, no, we're very open-minded. In fact, one of our regular attenders is an atheist, and we really fancy ourselves as open to atheists, and the challenge that atheists present to Christianity is very, productive of honesty and all the rest. And so I did this, and no sooner than a week went by, and they were like, I don't know if this is going to work out. Azusa dropped me, Loma Linda dropped me.
Because you had a lot of readers, right?
I did have a lot of readers right out the gate. I was on CNN, Brooke Baldwin's show, within the first week. I don't tell very many people, but Anderson Cooper wanted to have me on the same night I was on same day I was on Brooke Baldwin. But that was the day that Bridgegate broke with what's his face in New Jersey.
Yeah, the governor Christie.
Governor Christie, yeah, and that whole scandal hit the news cycle that day, and they bumped me, which is fine. But I just think it's kind of funny.
Yeah.
And NPR and all this stuff. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, I thought I'm just going to write a blog about this journey, and people were like, "A pastor tries atheism for a year," and apparently that was really catchy for about 6 months. Mm-hmm. So it died down. That hoopla died down, and I just kept writing, kept working through the year. The ups and downs, a decent amount of unemployment, pulling out some savings and just trying my best to stay afloat. Still sort of rebounding from those setbacks financially. Yeah. And that's kind of, and then at the end of that year of that blog called Year Without God, I felt that I was an atheist, and it was, but it wasn't by then it was not like a big dramatic thing. Yeah. Like, it was this realization that I was the same person I always was, with the same values, the same concerns, the same passions and sense of justice, but just without the overlay of a supernatural being that was supposedly guiding and directing everything.
No puppet master.
Yeah. No clockmaker, no puppet master, unanswered prayers are just unanswered prayers. Like, that's all, And again, I didn't feel any particular and now I'm really going to go get the Christians. I was just like, this doesn't work for me. Like, I'm much happier dealing with the world as I see it and encounter it. And I often say that most people I encounter are functional atheists. Like, they don't, if they get a flat tire, they get out and fix it. If their kid is having trouble in school, they get a therapist or a tutor. Or if you get sick, you go to the doctor. Like, people, you may also pray, but you are also aware that you probably need to take care of the issues that are facing you in your life, and that your version of God would probably want you to do that or whatever. So I'm like, okay, so nothing really changes. And this was part of my experiment. Yeah. If I stop praying and stop, pretending to stop urging myself to believe and really kind of, going down that path of discipline and nourishing myself, as it were, with the Bible and church and all of that, if I stopped all that, would my life suddenly change? And it didn't. And it was almost like, you'd almost expect there to be some change or something, right? And so that was part of it for me, and part of it was also like a sociological study of like who are atheists and what do they believe, and so that was the year, and then that was like the beginning of 2015. I kind of came to the end of that.
And did your wife? So at the end of that, your wife is.
Yeah, so we actually separated during that time period. Our relationship was like probably almost all relationships, ups and downs, strengths and weaknesses. But a lot of what was toward the end of our relationship, what was holding us together, in my opinion, was the sense that our whole lives were like an entangled ball, or is it Weezer who has the song about the sweater?
I don't know, but
the sweater song, where it's like, hold this thread as I walk away, and it just comes unraveled, and so like her faith and my faith and our relationship and my employment were all connected, and so I knew that if we separated and got divorced, even amicably, it would mean the end of my pastoral career. So we were like, that's a big price, and we don't hate each other. We're not like, it's not like we can't live one more minute like this. And we had kids, and we were like, we'll keep working on it. And so when the faith went, and that was a huge crisis of like financial crisis, but also existential and personal crisis, and it was just like a real topsy-turvy time, and we decided to call it, and so she stayed. I don't know for sure, but my guess is that she would call herself a Christian. I don't know what her weekly or spiritual religious practice is. My kids are essentially unchurched, I think. They're. In fact, my oldest daughter has just graduated from high school, and so she's right in this age demographic, and I wanted to get her to come with me, but part of the consequence of me being so busy running the conference is I would feel bad like bringing her here and just being like, okay, go, which she might have done, but even I left at 6 o'clock this morning to come down here, and she's not going to want to come down here at 6 o'clock in the morning. So anyway, she's come with me to certain events, and she's very open-minded about things. My youngest daughter is recently came out as a lesbian and has encountered some pushback from Christians in her life and is starting to have her own sort of like, why are they like that? So they're on their own path.
What is your, I suppose looking back on it, it's not been a long, long time ago.
5 years, yeah.
But obviously you feel in some ways like there's some gain, but I'm guessing you also feel like there's some loss somewhere in there too.
Sure.
So how would you describe the gains versus the losses?
I mean, the gains for me are peace of mind.
Because you think this is the truth.
Yeah, or at least it entails less cognitive dissonance for me.
Okay. Peace of mind that way.
Yeah, peace of mind like that. Yeah, just... and there's, of course, things like that infinite regress. I mean, if we go back far enough in history, you come to a point where I don't know.
Right.
And I would claim, like, nobody knows. Right? So I'm not worried about that. Sort of the whole cosmic origins of the universe thing is like, sure, I'll attend a lecture about it, but I am not hung up on that question. Like William Lane Craig got into it with me about that. He got into it about me. He never would engage with me.
Yeah, okay.
Even though I invited him to and asked him to, he preferred to talk about me in my absence, which he did a couple of times in a not very honest way.
Oh.
And he's.
I would certainly think that's disappointing from your side if you feel like he's essentially slandering you. You're not there or whatever. Yeah,
he basically claimed that I would lose my way, that I would become this immoral person, and that I was going through some terrible crisis, and he felt pity for me, essentially, And he basically was using my story as an example of what happens if...
I can't speak to what he said or did. I'll just take, my own perspective is that it really, really bothers me, and I'm not claiming he did this because I wasn't there,
Fair,
but you're clearly felt this way anyway. It really bothers me when fellow Christians, use people's story to sort of drumbeat their own theological issues, particularly when it's a way of sort of padding their own reputation or their own platform or whatever. I feel like seems like so obviously in tension with the sort of Jesus of the Gospels,
Yeah.
Anyway, but tell me about the loss side then.
Yeah, the losses for me were some family, career, sense of influence in the community. So by virtue of being clergy, I had become quite involved in city life in Los Angeles, and doors open for you in a certain way when people perceive you to be this person of the cloth, as it were.
Huh. And even in secular Los Angeles, so to speak.
Los Angeles is pretty religious in spite of it. It's a very interfaith heavy community. It's and I think that the city government still recognizes the historical legacy of religious communities, and so much of the conflict that we experience, especially lately, has religion in it somewhere.
Yeah. I think Pew Research, if I remember the latest data, is that 83% of those who identify as Democrats believe in God.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, there's not
that.
Yeah.
So, anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I just think the sense of belonging.
You didn't feel like the idea that this sort of reckoning with the fact that this life is it now?
That's certainly, yes. There was definitely that, on a more immediate level, there's the idea of feeling a little alone. It's hard for me to describe this without sounding patronizing or dismissive.
But I was an atheist, through middle school and high school.
Yeah.
Became a Christian in college, so I feel like it wouldn't be patronizing to me.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's sort of like, it's weird to me because I felt like there's this loneliness, but I also never really felt like God was super present either. But I told myself that he was present, and so I believed that he was present, and whether it was like, I'm having a really tough day, Lord help me, and it was more than just like a euphemism. It was like, I was really like, Lord help me.
Right. But people use the word spiritual in that case, right?
Right.
Because it means basically like no one else is present or feels like they're present because it's not tangible, physical, or whatever.
Right. And I think it's, that sense of really being alone. I would liken, my parents are both still living, but I would liken it to the feeling of having both of your parents die, like one and then finally the second one, and then really feel like, wow, it's just me. Before, there's always mom and dad, and if you could go home, or you could visit, or you could ask for a loan, or you know.
I think in a lot of ways you just described why people retain their faith.
Yeah, to have that kind of backstop. It was almost like, and I had this belief.
I don't mean it just in an emotional sense.
Right.
I mean it orients everything for them, not just a sort of an emotional feeling. But
right. Even if your dad isn't offering you a loan every month. It's in the back of your mind that he's there.
Yeah.
In case. And hopefully you never need it, and maybe you'll never need it. But it's just good to know that I could pick up the phone and Dad would be there, right? And maybe there's nothing he could physically do to help, but he'd listen to you, complain about whatever situation you're in. And then it's just like, well, there's nobody older than me in my family. It's just me. And that's a little bit...
Is it depressing?
It's a little sad. I think it was a little sad for me, looking into the void, and you're like, well, and the part that's a little condescending sometimes sounding to people is that to me it was like the experience of growing up. So but I don't want it to sound like I think that believers are infantile or haven't grown up.
Look, I mean, Christians, Paul wrote, didn't he, when I was a child.
I thought as a child.
So, I mean,
there are some
Christians describe their conversion the same way.
Right.
That I would describe it that way, that I feel like I then came to see the truth.
Right.
And so I don't think of it as patronizing. It's just an honest way it feels.
Assessment, yeah, so I think it does feel that way a little bit like leaving home to go to college, and you're like, oh gosh, I'm all by myself here, or the feeling I had taking my oldest daughter home from the hospital, and you're like, the nurses are taking care of everything in the hospital, and then they help you latch the seat into the car, and then they buckle the seatbelt, and they're like, okay, bye. And you're like, oh no,
Yeah.
what happens if she stops breathing? Like, you you just feel freaked out about this. So I guess that feeling of not having an older parent, like in the picture, and then also I think a little bit, I mean, I had kind of slowly let go of the afterlife picture in my mind, so that wasn't as hard for me. And Adventists didn't ever have theologically this idea that you would go straight to heaven or straight to hell. Like there's this soul death or soul sleep. The Adventist Church believes, and there's not an eternal hell in Adventism.
I would think that setting hell and heaven, the particular ways it's described or talked about in the popular imagination or in the Bible itself, I would think that for a guy who's so passionate about justice, that would be a big sense of, that there is, because obviously a lot of people are getting away with mass injustice.
Right.
Whereas,
That's a tough one. I hadn't thought of it in terms of loss, but yeah, that's a narrative loss. For sure. The idea that, and I've actually lectured about this and spoken about this in my travels around the country, that what I wish I still had is this idea that the arc of the history bends towards justice.
Yeah.
But I had started to sort of give up on that idea as a Christian, but now it's definitely like...
Obama didn't win you over with that remark?
Yeah, and it wasn't even King, was it? It was before King.
Well, yeah, just saying, he famously said it too, but it's
a nice idea, and it works if we bend it, but I think there's no promises. So one of my talks, I'm actually going to give a talk like this in Fullerton at a UU church later this month, called Learning to Live Without Promises. So Christianity and Judaism is so much about promises.
Yeah.
God's promises, and God's a promise
God
keeper.
who cannot lie is promised. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the promises, and I think becoming an atheist and a humanist is learning to live without those promises, learning to live with what I would describe as just cold, hard reality.
Yeah.
And just coming to terms with that. And I think for me, it's given me, in the long run, I've moved from a sense of loss about it to a real sense of awe, in a way, of like that I'm here at all, and that I get to live this life, and that it's beautiful, and I
of course have that same experience, but I refer it now to God, even though I didn't before. An interesting thing for me about this idea of justice, really in the last, I don't know, maybe 10 years, if I had to guess, was this little statement that Paul gives on Mars Hill, where he's describing the resurrection of Jesus, and he says specifically that God will bring righteousness to the world and justice, and he says through that man that God has given assurance that he's going to bring justice to the world through that man whom he raised from the dead. And I had not, previous to that, connected the idea that Christian hope wasn't just in the idea that, hey, Christ had life after death. Therefore, hey, I get to have life after death. But in that passage, what he's asserting is that because Christ was executed unjustly, that God raising him from the dead was a pledge. The Greek word is down payment. That he's a pledge that just as God reversed that injustice, that's a down payment that one day the whole world, the injustice will be reckoned. And I hadn't seen that connection between the resurrection and the idea of Christian hope and justice. So I only say that it's just that became especially meaningful to me in this context, you can imagine.
Totally. And I think it's such a, in many ways, a beautiful story.
Yeah, I think it's why it has had such power.
Right. I think, I've read this book that I would love to know what you think of it. It's called This Life, by a comparative literature professor at Yale named Martin Hageland. I'm going to have him on my podcast in a few weeks. And, he's not the first to make this point. He's sort of, for me, the first to make some associations, and I won't go into all of that. But one of the things that he really emphasizes is that it's, in his view, and I'm persuaded that it's basically you cannot value anything that is limitless in supply. Like it's, anything that would last like forever is something that you couldn't really appreciate in the long run. That the finite horizon of our lives is what actually makes us value them.
Yeah.
And that even Christians, he would claim, who have an infinite horizon,
right,
also value this life in a secular way. So that they're living almost in a bifocal sort of way.
Right, I get his
right,
point.
so that like if your child was in mortal danger, you probably, even if you're a Christian, you're probably not thinking, oh well, right? You're thinking, oh my God, how do I get to her? How do I call the cops? Do I how do I save her life? Yeah. Because her life is precious, and it's precious because it could end, and there's that. If it was like if she was like a superhero and couldn't die, you'd be like, she'll be fine, right?
Yeah, I don't know if I don't know. I'd have to think about it more.
Sure.
It doesn't seem immediately persuasive to me, just because of the there's other ways to determine value, I guess, because we like the life of our kid. We say there's no amount of money you can put on it, and I don't think of it as just because they're temporary entities, but nonetheless, we could go on and on.
Sure.
And I should probably wrap it up because we've already gone a lot longer than we normally do on the podcast. But I just really wanted to hear your story.
Yeah, for sure.
And to finally get to talk to you. And if I'm back next year, maybe we can do a round 2
on
a more narrow subject or something.
Yeah, and I'm sure that you and your partner can edit this down to a more reasonable length.
No, this is great. I think people want to hear the whole thing, honestly. And please listen to the after show where we get Drew's take on our conversation.
I can't wait myself.
Yeah, great. And really nice to talk to you, Ron.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right, this is Drew, and I'm back with Bill to talk about the conversation with Ryan that you just listened to. And Bill, man, I feel like I can really identify with a lot of Ryan's journey because, much of it was very related to his ability to, sort of keep believing the things that he felt like and I felt like, Christians have to believe. I thought one of the most interesting parts was when you really both agreed that Paul's stance is that homosexuality is a sin and that, women are... I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that Paul has a view of women in the church that is not equal to, or equivalent to, or the same as men. So I thought,
I mean, we certainly both seemed to read we both were interpreting the Bible basically the same way.
Right, and it was a problem
there
for
wasn't
him and not for you, which I thought was especially interesting on that point because it wasn't that there was a difference in. He wasn't saying, oh, well, no, I think the Bible says, that it's perfectly fine to be gay. No, he was saying that, he thought that the Bible was against that, and therefore he was against the Bible. And
it problematized his faith. I really, by the way, appreciated that because as a Christian, one of the frustrations is when people throw up their arms all the time saying it's very difficult to interpret the Bible, and I often feel like a lot of things that they're referencing aren't really that hard to understand. It's that they just don't agree with it, and I mean that even sometimes within the Christian world itself.
Well, you may want to be careful with that because the example that I was going to pull out was Exodus 21 when the decree of God is that if you have a slave that you beat severely and they die, then you should be punished. But if they don't die. I think it actually literally says if they become, if they recover in a day or two, is maybe the actual wording, that you're not to be punished. And so just the idea of that was maybe even more problematic for me, that this is not only a failure to punish slavery or even, abusive slavery, but it's almost explicitly the opposite. And so that's another example that for me, I would agree with Ryan. I think there are some times where we need to say, even if you're a Christian, I think you need to say that the Bible is wrong on this.
Yeah, so first of all, I really like that. I mean, in this case, it's much easier for me, I think, as a Christian to say historically now, meaning if you read Christians across all of history, St. Augustine or Aquinas or Luther or whoever, it's just easier to say, look, we believe these books. So they provide a standard view. They're an anchor to the way we understand things. And we're not having to constantly sort of reinterpret in each generation what they mean. When I read Martin Luther, about who, by the way, said some things I find horribly offensive, particularly about the Jews, but most of the time when he's interpreting the Bible, I feel like he's just reading it naturally, meaning reading it in the natural way, how it naturally means. And I think it's easier to talk about that. So I would far rather that we had a conversation like this where we're agreeing what it really says in Exodus or what it says in Romans 1 about same-sex relationships, and then having to work through that.
I agree. I don't think it's always so easy to interpret, the Bible or any other document, whether it's the U.S. Constitution or a work of fiction, or I think it's always hard to know what the original meaning was. But in these kind of cases where we can all agree that's the meaning, I think I'll use the word morally right thing to do is to say that the Bible's wrong. I don't understand how Christians can say that just because it's in the Bible that makes it right or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason Christians say they think it's right is because they really believe this is the Word of God, and they've come to trust the Scripture as being actually a revelation of God and the way He thinks about us and the way He thinks about the world and the way He thinks about Himself. So, like any trust thing, you get a high degree of trust, and then where there are things you may not understand, like I'm not going to pretend to understand everything about Exodus 21 and why it is the way it is, I would feel like, I have a high degree of trust across, the book of Exodus as a whole. I have one really big question about Exodus 21. In other words, I find the other 39 chapters really easy to trust this God, but I do have a big question about the one you referenced, the passage you referenced.
Yeah, I mean that's a problem for me. I just feel like there are enough things that are really wrong in the things that there are certainly things I will grant you that seem right. I mean, obviously, the entire idea, whether we can agree that it originated in the Bible or not, but the entire idea of the golden rule I fully subscribe to, right? So there's things like that I would obviously not argue with. I just don't understand why there would be something as plainly wrong that I think you can say, well, okay, I read the LGBT stuff the same as Ryan does. I just choose to agree with God that for some reason that's not the way He wanted things. And but I think you're doing something different about Exodus 21, right? You're saying, I agree that this says, these are the prescriptions for what to do and the laws that should surround slavery. But you wouldn't agree. Yeah. I don't think you would assert that those are right. Those are morally right, as stated in Exodus 21.
Right. I think you're right. There is a difference there, although maybe not as big of a gap as you think, because I do still think that the laws were right, but maybe not in quite the same way. And here's two thoughts I have on it, which I'm sure we didn't start the podcast to discuss this whole thing right after Ryan. But nonetheless, I think it's worth discussing. The first thing is that if I compare sort of the laws of Moses in Exodus 21 against Hammurabi's code or the other laws that I do know of from ancient history, I find that the ones in Exodus are far. If I were a slave, I would far rather have lived in Israel than any other ancient society, because they had very strict guidelines about how they were supposed to, their attitudes, what they were supposed to be towards slaves, and there were all sorts of rules about how long someone could be a slave and so on. So all the stuff about being a sojourner coming into the land of Israel and how you were to be treated, there was a very high bar for that. And how you were to treat your slaves, how women were to be treated. There was a very high bar for that compared to other ancient societies, I'm saying. So that sort of stands out to me. So I'm inclined to think there's still something there about it being good, or at least a lot better. And then the other side is you have these teachings of Jesus about how some of the laws in the Old Testament, like the law of divorce, where they were allowed to have divorce, Jesus specifically said God allowed it for their society for that time, as he said, because of the hardness of their hearts. Meaning he didn't make every law to be exactly, to regulate things exactly as he intended it one day to be. But he allowed some things to remain as inferior to what God eventually intends humanity to live, how he intends them to live in his kingdom. And even Jesus himself, right, took some of the laws from the Old Testament and elevated them to a higher level and said that living life in the kingdom of God needs to be at a higher level even from these laws.
Yeah, I guess it all seems very squishy to me, and I don't understand why somebody couldn't just do the same thing with the New Testament and say, well, Paul was just saying, that he was against this or that, women in leadership in the church or LGBT stuff, because of, he was comparatively he was right against the rest of the culture because they were having crazy orgies in their religious services, and so he was just a little more right, but not really truly correct.
Mm-hmm. Well, the difference there is that it was Jesus who was the one that offered that assessment of the law, and from my perspective, Jesus was the lawgiver. So in other words, there's not someone nowadays to go around who has that authority to offer a better understanding of what Jesus said other than Jesus himself, or of what Moses said. So that would be the difference.
Well, but I mean, Jesus already said it about Moses, so I'm not sure why we should assume any different about Paul, is what I'm saying.
Well, because I think of Paul as being sent out by Jesus, meaning Paul went out as an apostle of Jesus. He was,
Well, obviously, we're going to have a divide.
In other words, I mean, you may not. Obviously, I don't expect you to believe it, but from my perspective, Paul, when he's writing his letters and he's teaching and preaching the gospel, he's doing it under the auspices that he's been chosen, selected, and sent out by Jesus. He's a diplomat, right? That's what an apostle is. He's a spokesman for Jesus. So you're getting. Yeah.
Well, obviously we're going to have a divide about whether or not the things the Bible says are useful and good and all right. I'm obviously not going to adhere to that. And I think it's interesting. I wouldn't put Ryan in this camp because he agreed with you about what at least that Paul was saying. But some Christians will just sort of, I don't know. I mean, I'd say there's probably a disingenuous way to do it and a more ingenuous way to do it, if that's even a word. You can say, oh, well, we're just going to reinterpret anything ad hoc that we want to, right? We're just going to say,
right.
Okay, well, after 1800, slavery's, after 1865, slavery's wrong, and so we're just going to reinterpret the Bible when it talked about slavery, or after, 1995 or whatever. God changed his mind about that. That's the disingenuous way to interpret the Bible. But I would say that there are Christians who believe that the Bible is not inerrant and is not perfect, and that it's written by men, and that men had their own issues with it, and that there are some good things in it, and God delivered his message in it, but it's not meant to be used as a perfected sort of handbook, that sort of thing. So
you're saying there's Christians who?
I think there are Christians who would say that. Yeah.
I think so too. It's just that they're not in line with the way that the first Christians understood the Scripture. So it seems like it's not a very Christian attitude from my perspective. Going back, in other words, ultimately Christianity is defined by.
Well, it sounds like
teachings of
Ryan might
Jesus
agree
and
with
his
you,
followers.
and since we're
that's
reacting
true.
to him, I should at least let him have the final word on that. And again, I think he and I would agree that is where we part with Christianity, if that's got to be the main
Well, and
line.
I think you both share that experience of going into what you might call free thinking, where you felt that the Bible was constricting your thinking in the sense that you or maybe constricting your beliefs, because you felt something was wrong, like the Exodus 21 passage, but you felt constrained, like Ryan described how it was like the Bible was telling him something, and he felt this pressure to have to believe it, when in fact his mind felt like it was just wrong. He just was judging it to be wrong. And so by eventually dropping his belief altogether, he feels sort of free of those constrictions. Isn't that what you were you were hinting at?
I think he said it well, and I still agree with that. I think that the act of sort of not just saying I don't know, but actually assenting to and asserting a belief that you think is wrong is too high of a hurdle to ask of us mere humans. But anyway,
I can relate to that for sure. So obviously I have it. It's a little bit different from the other side. For me, it was more like sort of coming into the light. But I can still relate to that. Like we talked about the Exodus 21 passage, I can still relate to that. So excellent.
Yeah. Well, I think the divide is pretty clear. We probably don't even need to restate it, but I appreciated the conversation you had with Ryan. So thanks for doing that, and thank you, Ryan, for being on the podcast. It was awesome.
Absolutely. I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic. Thanks for listening.
The Divide is produced by Alan and Ben Hawbrooks and edited by John Workman. Dalton Reed handles IT. Join us for further discussion on this topic at our subreddit, TheDividebyiPUB. To learn more about other episodes and who we are, check out ipub.org/thedivide. See you next time on The Divide.